Today we are looking at another futures thinking tool, and one that is foundational to almost every bit of futures work that you may do, and that is driver mapping. Now this is especially useful when it comes to identifying and analysing the forces that are shaping our future. So for driver mapping, we define drivers as the influential forces that shape or transform systems. Driver mapping is one of the most critical tools in futures thinking, and it plays a big role in the systematic examination of change factors. It's part of a larger toolkit as well, used by organisations such as UK government, civil service, and it comes as part of the Government Office for Science Futures Thinking Toolkit. Essentially, it's used almost everywhere by almost everyone, and the key output for this is we get to see the interactions between different drivers. So driver mapping can help us identify the most influential forces in a system, and it's very useful when it comes to separating critical drivers from less influential ones. This knowledge can then feed into broader futures analysis and be used for strategic planning, or it can be used for policy development, particularly for very complex policy areas such as climate change and the economy. It helps organisations prepare for multiple possible futures, and it's really useful when it comes to identifying both risks and opportunities in future scenarios. So just to clarify what we are talking about when we talk about drivers, because there are several terms that pop up when we get into the world of futures thinking. Drivers are the fundamental forces that shape the future of a domain or a particular area. We'll come on to the domains shortly. They are not established trends. So if you think of an aging population, that is a well-established trend that has existed and exists now and will exist into the future. Drivers have a higher degree of uncertainty about them and a more ambiguous direction. There are also some other terms that you will see on the screen there. Megatrends is one that you'll quite often hear. So these are super big trends that have a large or long time horizon and that will impact multiple other systems. Wildcards are a whole other family, or a whole family of themselves, everything from black swans, grey rhinos, all sorts of strange animal names that they have, some of these. High impact events that seem unlikely but can have significant consequences. You can probably think of a few that have happened in the past few years alone. And they are often laughed off or dismissed until they happen. And weak signals are early signs of small changes that may indicate future strategic discontinuities, which is a great word. But today we're looking at driver mapping, so we are focusing on drivers. So let's have a look at some example ones to help solidify this. Changing nature of work, including remote working, and a change in the sectors of work. So the remote working shift is somewhat predictable. It's not a complete surprise that it's happened, but exactly the extent to which it's happened and the pace that it happened and where it's going next is quite hard to define. So it's ambiguous, like we saw on the definition slide earlier. Shifts in where and how people live. So we might see people moving into the cities or out from the cities. We might be able to make some fairly good guesses about how this is happening and the rate at which it's happening, but it's still difficult. There's a lot of ambiguity there. And also business influence on political decision making. That's very hard to pin down to specifics. And these drivers are all coming from a piece of work that we will look at shortly as a case study. So when we look at drivers, we have external and internal drivers. So as you can probably guess, external drivers originate outside the organisation that's doing this work, and they are typically beyond its direct control. So these might be changes in technology or political factors. Customer requirements might change, market competition, or environmental conditions. Internal drivers emerge from within the organisation and are generally under its control. So these can include organisational strategy, company structure, employee morale, technological capabilities or capacities, and improvements in processes. Now these drivers, internal and external, all interact within systems and they create complex dynamics. And it's very important to consider the short-term and long-term impacts of these drivers. Now, understanding the drivers and how they interact can very much help with creating robust strategies and plans for the future. We've got PESTLE on the screen there, which is one of the most common ways to categorize these drivers. There's a few others that you'll come across in the world of futures. PESTLE sometimes has an extra E on the end when they add in ethics or ethical. Steeple is essentially PESTLE but spelt a different way. And Steep V, which is not catchy in any way, swaps legal for values. But most of the time you'll probably see PESTLE. These are not a requirement. You don't have to use one of these frameworks, but they are extremely helpful when you're answering the big questions of looking at drivers in complex systems. You will generate lots and lots of ideas, and it can be very helpful to have some sort of framework to help categorize them. And PESTLE's most likely the one that you'll use. So we talked about system interactions. What exactly is that, and how do we categorize it? Well, there's interconnectedness, and that's where we consider how the changes in one driver can trigger responses in others. For example, new technology like AI might exist seemingly overnight. It's not actually overnight, but it can feel that way. And that might necessitate upskilling, training of staff. So that's an internal driver. Feedback loops, where you have an interaction between drivers that can create reinforcing or balancing feedback loops. So you might have a positive customer response as an external driver, and that might boost employee morale internally. So that's an internal driver, which then creates a more excited, more dedicated innovation team internally who wants to create more products to please more customers and get that positive feedback loop again. Cascading effects, a single driver change can set off a chain reaction. And these can quite often be negative. They're not always negative, but you see cascading effects in biological systems as well, where one part of a biological system may fail and then multiple other systems that depend on that first one will then fail, and it feeds down that way. Synergies and conflicts, that's where some drivers may work together to amplify a change, whilst others might create resistance or conflict and then slow down or prevent change. Time lags, the effect of some drivers might not be immediately apparent, which can amplify the complexity of studying these systems when you have lag indicators and lead indicators. So not everything is happening at the same time with the same amount of delay. So say you've done your brainstorming, you've picked a diverse group of people with different grades, different abilities, who work in different areas within an organization, and you ask them to identify what they think is driving change and to think in a global context. You might just ask each person to work on one or two of the PESTLE categories to help overcome some of that blank page terror and to focus their creative thoughts. When they're coming up with these drivers, it's useful to have short descriptive phrases to make the drivers clear, and also to give some indication of the direction of this driver. So rather than just listing the economy as a driver, you might want to say that there is exponential economic growth in China, for example. And that's much easier to then work with and categorize on a chart such as the one you see on the screen there. Sometimes you might want to split these drivers into short, medium and long term as well, particularly if you have generated a lot. So this importance and certainty 2x2 is another frequently used tool when it comes to driver mapping. So what you can do is take the ones that you have, the drivers you have come up with, and place them on these in one of these 4 quadrants, or overlapping. They will quite often overlap one or more. Fairly self-explanatory. I think you can see where this one's going. If you focus on the top left, which is the most important and the most certain, those are worth prioritizing and acting on as soon as you can, because we know they're important and we know they're very likely to happen. So it's a safe bet that work in this area will pay off. If it's important and not so certain, then that's something we can work on with scenario planning. So we're still working on that area, but we're not looking to implement things immediately, but we are looking to prepare for them. And for drivers that are less important, we either park them or track them. So if they're not that important and they're not that certain, we make a note of them, but we don't really work with them. But if they're not that important, but still quite likely to happen, it's worth keeping an eye on, so they're worth tracking. When you place your drivers on here, quite often you'll have several that are quite similar, or at least related in a category. So it can be beneficial to cluster them together, so thin the herd of, rather than 100 or so sticky notes, you can categorize them and then place them as a category on this matrix. What you do with these is up to you. Obviously, it depends where in your stage of futures planning you are working on. So sometimes you'll use these drivers as the input for the first stage of a scenarios exercise, where you'll then choose your axes of uncertainty. And this can help you to build a set of scenarios of different futures to explore alternative ways that, for example, a policy area might need developing. If you're doing this as the first part of a visioning workshop, here where you've looked at your drivers that are important and have a certain outcome, is so the top left one in this diagram. These are drivers where you can then use visioning to describe the positive outcomes for addressing these drivers. So that's lots of sort of practical theory advice. Let's have a look how it's been implemented in a case study. This was done by the Government Office for Science. This was their Net Zero Society forecast or foresight report. So they were asked to look at what society might be like in the year 2050, in particular when it comes to net zero and greenhouse gas emissions. So during their driver mapping, they came up with 18 critical uncertainties. So things are important, but they're not sure what's going to happen. So on the screen, they can see how they've mapped them, importance and uncertainty, and then they've categorized them with PESTLE, which we looked at earlier. This is what they can look like. This is how they chose to present them in this report. So you can see again, grouped by PESTLE, we've got political and economic on the screen there. And you might recognize a couple of them from an earlier slide. So they've put them on here and they've listed them with a short description to further explain what they're referring to, and also with some extra references for supporting data. So that's a quick rundown of driver mapping. It's a foundational tool, one that you will almost certainly use for every bit of futures work you do. Fairly straightforward. You can generate an awful lot of ideas. It's worth having a good mix of people together when you do this exercise. different areas, different skill sets, and they'll have different views on what might impact their particular position within an organisation. I hope this has been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.